Hello, everyone. Good day, wherever it is you're dialing in from. My name is Dr. Doreen Atewolagun. I am director at Delta, and welcome to our inaugural Delta Talk series. So, in this series, we'll be talking about what you, our listeners, can do to create diverse and inclusive and equitable cultures at work. At Delta, we believe that where each person flourishes, organizations thrive. And we pride ourselves in the work that we do on evidence based diversity and inclusion, offering practical solutions that work. So, in this series, we will be discussing topics that are important to you. We anticipate conversations based on common themes or challenges facing our clients, prevailing trends in the news and more broadly in society that impact inclusion strategies at work, but also research and thought leadership to help you start thinking and acting differently to make change happen for inclusion in a sustainable way. We will also be keen to hear from you. What would you like to hear more about from us? What topics or ideas do you struggle with? What do you want some helpful clarification on? For those joining us live, there will be an opportunity to complete a very short 4-question survey to tell us more about this. You can also email us on info@deltaalphapsi.com with anything inclusion related you would like us to help you figure out. So we will be putting this information in the show notes when we post this recording, but we will also put it in the chat now. Our sessions will be recorded and shared on our website afterwards. For all of you who have joined us today, we will follow up with an email and a link to the recording. We have also enabled live captioning. For our audience joining us live right now, we will stop the recording at the end of the dialogue and we will open up for questions. However, of course, we welcome questions in the chat. Keep them coming at any point in time. Welcome. I'm now going to pass to my co-host, Dr. Manjari Prashar.
Thanks, Joanne, and hello, everyone. I'm Manjari Prashar. I'm a strategic advisor and executive coach at Delta. And today, in this session of Delta Talks, the inclusion ecosystem, Joanne and I will provide insights on how you can rethink your organization's approach to D&I strategy and take measurable action. We will discuss why most D&I initiatives fail to make measurable change, and we will explain how and why Doyen developed the inclusion ecosystem approach for making organizational change that sticks. So I am really excited about this conversation. Doyen?
Same here, Manjari. I'd like to invite you to kick us off then, perhaps a little bit more about yourself and why exactly you're excited to have this conversation.
Absolutely, Diane. It's a pleasure. And I know that when we thought about having this talk, this was the topic I wanted to discuss and be a part of. So I've worked closely with you and the team at Delta for nearly 5 years now. And you might recall about 5 years ago when I was wrapping up my PhD and you were the director of the Gender Leadership and Inclusion Center at Cranfield University, we had a series of conversations about making inclusion work. We were both worried about this. It isn't happening. And by that time, I had been in the workforce for over 25 years and in various roles in banking and IT, but also as an executive coach and cross-cultural management consultant, delivering workshops in global organizations. And to be honest with you, I was pretty demotivated and jaded by then. We weren't seeing significant change. The same issues and barriers to career progression that I had experienced as a woman in banking, and particularly as a minoritized woman, when I started my career, these things were still happening. So stereotypes, leadership models, recruitment and progression models were still being designed and implemented with loads of biases solidly baked in. We were not working in a truly meritocratic environment, even though many companies were claiming to me, it was clear that we wasn't. We weren't in that kind of environment. So I was wondering, as perhaps many in the audience today have also wondered, do all these D&I initiatives that we work on, do these really make an impact? Do they make a difference in organizations? Do they in fact lead to better working relationships and to more equity at work? I had heard you share your research and we had spoken a few times. What struck me in speaking to you was the clarity with which you were able to present and unpack the complex DNI issues that I was observing in organizations. So when I heard you speak about the need to address the ecosystem, where a shared understanding of the barriers to equity is required, and I will stress that a shared understanding is required, and where everyone has a role to play, I was intrigued. And it sounded like a really new way, a fresh way to think about implementing DNI. But I did wonder, I said, how would this approach, which you call the inclusion ecosystem, how could this be put into practice in organizations? And it was great to hear you explain it. And I could see that it was evidence-based. We were both researchers at Cranfield at the time, so that was a relief to me. It was evidence-based. It was practical and measurable, and it gave me hope and a renewed commitment to my work. And since then, it's been a wonderful experience working on Delta's inclusion ecosystem programs. And that's what I'm excited about. I'd love for you to share your insight with our audience today.
Thanks, Manjari. I'm delighted to hear that. Okay, yes, happy to kick off. Where should we start?
Okay, well, let's start with the definition. How do you
Makes
define
sense.
inclusion ecosystem?
Totally makes sense. Okay, so how do we define the inclusion ecosystem? If we think about that phrase, I'd like to just break it down, and we'll first start with, what does the word ecosystem mean? What is an ecosystem? It's a term taken from biology, and essentially it is a network or interconnected or interdependent system of different subgroups that interact with each other for a broad common goal. And if you think about organizations, organizations are made up of interconnected social groups. So when we think of the expression inclusion ecosystem, that leads us to think it is an interdependent system of individuals and groups who work together to intentionally create a culture of inclusion in an organization. Let me bring this to life a little. So to all of our listeners, just imagine all the ways you're interconnected to people and groups, either at home, in your communities, or at work. And let's imagine someone who is in the workplace and is a new joiner, they just started a new job. And let's think about the different systems or groups that they connect with. So first off, of course, they have HR. They have HR. HR perhaps, puts their name on their payroll, perhaps creates their induction plan. They also have IT. IT would provide their tech, will provide their equipment. There's also their line manager. The line manager will set out like their performance expectations. And then there's the team members. The team members might show them the ropes, and on and on and on. Now, the important thing to highlight is at any one of those points, one can be made to feel either included and regarded, or excluded and disregarded. And we know from the research that inclusion does not just happen, inclusion along the range of different dimensions of gender, culture, religion, faith, social, economic status, various abilities, sexual orientation. It doesn't just happen. Actually, we need to be intentional about it, and we need an alignment between the collective and the individuals. So if we think about an effective inclusion ecosystem, using this example of this new joiner again, imagine an organization where HR is really thinking about belonging in their induction plan, like really thinking, how do we incorporate the values of belonging in our induction plan so that everyone, regardless of, for example, their faith or regardless of their sexual orientation, feels seen, feels affirmed. And let's continue with that example. Imagine that they are working with the IT team, and the IT team supplies them with technology that maximizes accessibility so that people across a range of different disabilities are able to do their work. And again, think through, imagine their line managers. Their line managers are giving them ongoing forthright feedback. They're giving feedback to everyone in their team, regardless of the ways in which they might connect with them, regardless of how their backgrounds might be different. And the line managers are also really thinking for the team how they can create psychologically safe spaces for difference, regardless of that difference to be leveraged. And then finally, imagine the team that this person belongs to, and imagine the team thinking through how do we support your, you're joining in your socialization, you're, hanging out with us and learning the ropes, but also creating a positive social environment such that regardless of your hobbies or regardless of whether or not you can join in after work drinks, they create a space that makes you feel seen and affirmed. So this is what we help organizations do. We help organizations provide insights. We help organizations think through what skills they need. We help organizations think through what strategic direction they want to take with regards to intentionally creating inclusive ecosystems.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Thanks. So helpful to hear that and that illustration. And this was the concept you shared with me all those years ago. And that, we've been putting into practice at Delta with our clients. And I mentioned earlier that I was jaded and unmotivated then. A few years ago, I was wondering if I wanted to continue on in this profession. And I'll tell you why, because I think at that time I did feel D&I strategies were failing or would fail or wouldn't make an impact. And that's because they didn't think about the whole ecosystem. There wasn't an understanding of this, what you've just described, the requirement to bring everyone into the conversation. At that time, again, as an executive coach and facilitator, I worked with senior leaders, line managers, minoritized groups, and loads of culturally diverse teams. I was increasingly troubled by the different conversations and positions each group seemed to be adopting. So there was more and more talk about D&I, and yet everyone's understanding was different, their engagement was different. So for example, some junior and mid-level managerial women in an organization I worked with spoke to me about their experiences of sexism. And then they also said, it's not worth calling it out. Nothing will happen. And I will jeopardize my career going forward. In the same organization, several male and even some female senior leaders would say that they've never seen or heard of any sexism. And in any case, they were convinced that it would never be tolerated and that the woman would surely call it out if the issues were really arising. So in this way, this lack of understanding, this lack of discussion meant that the issues, the barriers that needed addressing were buried and silenced across hierarchy levels. At the same time, I remember as a coach in several coveted women's leadership programs in leading UK organizations, I would hear minoritized women say that the programs don't seem to address their challenges. So these are women's leadership programs, and yet I worked with women from China, from India, from across the globe, but also women from within the UK with different ethnic backgrounds. And they would say over and over again, this is a great program. There's a lot I'm learning, but there's so many issues that I face that aren't being addressed. And they would talk about amongst themselves. They would actually gather around me and have a discussion around the specific stereotypes that they face. And they would say, well, we face a different set of stereotypes. And they would agree with each other. But when I asked them, well, will you talk about this broadly in plenary? Will you come in there and talk about it? And they wouldn't share it out of fear of sounding ungrateful or negative about a highly regarded program. Black and Asian women in particular really talked about stereotypes, and they also realized that the things they faced were different from what their white female colleagues were facing in terms of barriers. But this was not being talked about. And at the same time, when I was coaching and working with white women, and my fellow colleagues seemed to believe and actually intended, really in their heart, wanted the program to serve all women equally. So once again, due to this lack, these groups that were separate, these silos, we lacked a shared understanding of the diverse set of experience and perspectives of people in different social identity groups, as well as across hierarchies and function areas. And that's when I began to see these echo chambers where members of one group amplify and reinforce each other's views, but they fail to see or engage with different views, especially on these highly emotive topics such as equality and fairness. So conversations across hierarchy lines, across social groups were simply not taking place. Senior leaders lacked confidence on how to talk about race, how to talk about equity and fairness. Line managers feared saying the wrong thing to their direct reports from minoritized backgrounds, and HR and network leads felt powerless to call out inequities directly. And minoritized colleagues did not feel empowered or heard and did not feel ready to talk about it. And as a result, we were not working in truly meritocratic and transparent organizations. I did begin wondering, how are we going to make a difference? And how are we going to make people and help people have an honest sharing of different viewpoints and awareness of lived career experiences? Diane.
Oh, wow, Manjari, thank you for sharing that. There's so much in there. And reinforcing the point that you made around really thinking about different people's kind of positions in the hierarchy, as well as different people's identities, social identities. Perhaps in a different webinar, we'll talk about some of the foundations of how social groups and social identities influence us and correlate or interact with the work that we do, and how we use that as a research base for thinking through some of our solutions, including the inclusion ecosystem. But the other thing you're raising that comes to my mind is the importance of intersectionality, and the importance, again, something that we work with clients about within the inclusion ecosystem, is thinking about the multiple identities, how assumptions we have about women's experiences in leadership are can be problematized, i.e., there's some limitations to it if we don't really think about the relationship between, for some women, between their gender and their faith, or their gender and their ethnicity or race. So thank you for bringing those comments, those thoughts to our attention. And so if we kind of go back to thinking about, the expression that you use, where you talked about moving from echo chambers to the ecosystem. This is exactly what we do. We help organizations make this transition. And I'd love for you to share with us maybe an example of how has come to pass in your experience.
Certainly. I mean, again, echo chambers that we're working on. So we're currently working on an inclusion ecosystem with an organization, and I think in one of the early stages, we had a session with a group of senior leaders, and this came up exactly. The senior leaders sort of complained to me, or complained in a group discussion, that some of his minoritized staff now, as a result of all of this discussion around D&I, there are people who seem to see the issue of racism everywhere. And he said, whereas he and his colleagues see it nowhere. So he asked, how can he possibly help eliminate something that he doesn't see? And instead he said, why don't you work with the people who see this? Maybe help them increase their confidence, help them develop leadership skills, and so help the underrepresented groups build up their confidence. And as he was saying this, I could see very naturally all of his colleagues were nodding. There was agreement. And so to me, that was an echo chamber. It wasn't I empathize with the position. I don't understand it, but I realize that that's what happens. We can sit in groups and agree, and we say none of us sees it, so it doesn't happen, or we see it everywhere, so it happens all the time. It's about really starting to talk to each other and get a different understanding.
Totally, that fully resonates. And it's exactly why I developed the idea of the inclusion ecosystem, because when I was doing my PhD on leadership and diversity, a number of themes came up for me, some of which you've referred to. And yeah, these themes, well, the research I was doing was 15 years ago, so some of the ideas are common now, but they were more novel back in those days. But one of these concepts that you've just referred to, Manjari, is that the assumption that the onus of the work to diversify leadership or talent pipeline is on the underrepresented group. right? For example, like you said, asking women to be more confident before they can become leaders. Like you do the work to become more confident to be a leader in this organization. The thing is that we know, and I'm going to quote our colleague, Dr. Anne-Marie Baker here, that essentially, if you have a leaking pipe, really, would you blame the water, right? If you have a leaking pipe, would you blame the water? Would you say, you know what, water, you are the problem? Or would you, more logically, focus on the pipe as the problem to fix? And so this is our position. Like when you zoom out and think about the whole organization, and you think about the organization, the problem of inclusion, and you think whose problem is the lack of inclusion, and who has the capacity to fix alienating cultures, you will see that different peoples or groups within the organization have a role to play in this. So our inclusive ecosystem approach works with what we call kind of different members of the inclusion ecosystem or stakeholders. And that might be, for example, line managers, that might be HR, or diversity and inclusion D&I specialists. It may well be senior leaders working with them to be allies, as well as underrepresented people. So we'll work with, for example, folks with disabilities, or women of all ethnicities, or people of color of all genders, and work with them, like Manjari has said, to create a collective understanding of the different experiences and really encourage each group to see it from the other's perspectives rather than rely solely on things that they have directly experienced. And very importantly, from a Delta perspective, we draw on what the research says. So essentially say, what is the evidence? What do we know about each ecosystem stakeholder group? What do we know about their role in creating inclusive culture? What does the research say? Published research, but also depending on the organization, what's going on within that organization. And after we surface that, we help each ecosystem group build their capacity for creating and sustaining inclusive cultures.
Thanks, Toyin. That's very clear. And that's idea that we work with each group, and that could be a group that's defined around hierarchy, that could be a social identity group, that could be a functional role. That's very clear. I'm just imagining a number of our listeners are thinking, and that it would make sense to me that perhaps the question is out there. I'm not sure if anyone's put that on chat yet. Well, how do we know it works? How do we know this works? I came to you because I was like, I don't know if the other stuff works. How do we know this works?
Indeed, great question. And you know what, Manjari, I might turn it back to you because you have so much experience working with our ecosystem members. I think our listeners will appreciate hearing from your own practical experience. So over to you, what are some of the examples that you have had of evidence that this works?
Thanks, Doyen. So that is true. I've worked on a number of the inclusion ecosystem programs over the past few years, and more recently, we've been working with our colleague Hada Hussain on a number of inclusion ecosystem programs as well. And I think we had a discussion about this and in preparation for this talk, and we both agreed that we are confident that it works because we measure the impact. At the very minimum, we run a pre and a post program survey with every program. But if possible, we would do more, and we would do a more longitudinal study as well. And some of our clients, we continue to work with over a period of time, and then we can see the shift. Hada and I recently reviewed a number of program evaluation survey results and found that in all program across the board, in different degrees, there was an improvement. The improvement was on 3 levels: awareness. So this idea of you can't say you don't see this problem anywhere. It's about awareness and understanding, a shared awareness of where the issues are in that particular organization. But it was also about motivation. I think once people become aware, then there's a motivation and a desire to make change. And finally, actions and steps taken, or plans for actions that can be taken. So for example, line managers often tell us that they definitely feel more equipped to give constructive feedback to all their direct reports, because that's one thing we find, that across difference, if there is a difference, especially perhaps a difference across race and ethnicity or gender, we don't get as a good quality feedback. And line managers realize this and say, yep, after the program, I feel like I can do this. Senior leaders express a much deeper understanding of the culture change that's required. They realize that this has to go beyond a tick box exercise of approving a few programs, or being, signing a charter here and there. It's really about a deep culture change. And they then also express a deep desire to leverage their position of power to address barriers directly, to address barriers faced by minoritized staff. And while at the same time, we engage with the HR departments and DNI groups, network leads, and what they tell us is they have found clearer ways to articulate the issues and to influence others. They understand what they need to say and who they need to go to influence change. And at the same time, our minoritized staff that we're working with tell us they feel heard, they feel understood, and as a result, feel empowered to work with senior leaders, to work with line managers, to talk about the issues, and to help transform their environment.
I love that, Manjari. So I know we haven't talked about this on this conversation so far, but what you're also doing is you're drawing the thread between our theory of change, where there is raising awareness, equipping with an idea of why I'm doing this, what my own motivation is. So building will, and then supporting with skills, practical tools that I need to do for action. And so, when we talk about the different types of people who are like, actually, now I know, now I see, now I understand what I need to do, and now I know how I need to do this. This is the work that we do. This is exactly what we do. And we also need to ensure that we measure impact at all those levels. When we measure impact at different levels, we can get a sense, and we can get there's a finger on the pulse of how this inclusive culture is being created. And so I just want to spell out the different levels. Again, like Manjari said, this is our general approach to creating and sustaining inclusive culture transformation in organizations. We think, okay, what is going on at the individual or micro level, and how do we gather data on that? And then we also gather data on what's referred to as the meso level, or departmental or group level, with some organizations. And then also we look at what's happening at the macro level, at the organizational level. So those three levels, like individual, group or team, and organization, give us different degrees of insight into what's happening and what changes and what the evidence for change is. And because culture change takes time, we also gather data in the immediate here and now, and also in the long term. And finally, because we know from the research that qualitative and quantitative data have different roles to play in just that shift from awareness to will to skill, and in making change happen, we gather both types of data too. And so certainly if our listeners want, we're very happy to discuss measurement and impact in a follow-up webinar.
Thanks so much, Dorian. And I know that you and I can talk about this for forever. We love talking about this. So anyone have more questions, want to talk some more, do get in touch. But let's round up for today. Let's open this up to questions. I know there's lots of great chat going on out there. So what are we saying? What we are saying that it's important to structure your D&I initiatives around 3 principles if you are basing it on an inclusion ecosystem approach. So the 3 principles are: 1, engage everyone, because this is a collective mission. There can be no silos, no bystanders. Everyone should be made accountable and held responsible to create and maintain a culture of equity. That includes board members, senior leaders, line managers, rainmakers, colleagues, trainees, everyone, right? So principle 1, engage everyone. This is a collective mission. Principle 2, but tailor your approach. It is also an individual commitment. Don't assume that everyone is on the same learning path or has the same perspective. Think about the different ways in which we need to communicate with them, and think about the different ways in which individuals and groups contribute to the problem and can contribute to the change. So different skills, different knowledge, and different approaches will be required. So in addition to this being a collective mission and an individual commitment, it's also, the third principle is go beyond best practice to evidence-based practice. And by that, we mean from program design all the way through to program implementation and beyond, apply and collect qualitative and quantitative data to ensure that the meaningful change that you're after is happening across the ecosystem. So those are the three principles for me, Diane.
Yeah, thanks so much, Manjari. I think that's it. So everyone, it's an individual journey. Principle one, principle two, but it's also a collective journey. And principle three, all of these data points are measurable. And what we can do in the show notes, we can share with you a link to evidence-based diversity and inclusion that's based on an article that me and some of my colleagues wrote a few years ago. So you can reference that if it is of interest. So thank you everyone for tuning in. With Delta Talks, we will be talking about what you can do to create diverse, inclusive, and equitable cultures at work. At Delta, we believe that when each person flourishes, organizations thrive, and we are proud of the work that we do, evidence-based and offering practical solutions that work. Like I said, we are keen to hear from you. What would you like us to discuss? What would you like further clarification on? So for those joining us live, there will be an opportunity to complete a 4-question survey to tell us more about what you would like to hear from and what we'd like to hear about. And you can also email us on info@deltaalphapsi.com with anything inclusion related you would like us to help you figure out. We will put this in the chat again, and we will also put it in the show notes. Our sessions will be recorded and shared on our website afterwards. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for your engagement. We will follow up with an email and address any questions we may not have time to pick up today. So next time, do tune in as Delta Talks, the meritocracy myth. And for our live audience, we will now stop recording and we'll open up for more conversation for the next 10 minutes or so. Thank you, everyone.